Welcome to another episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast. Last week we covered progressive overload and hybrid training as a concept and kind of an overview of how to approach it. And today we're going to talk about the specifics more in detail of how to progress the strength side of that equation in hybrid training. So if you missed the last episode, definitely I would recommend going back and listening to that first for context. I'm going to give a very short four bullet point recap. But the last podcast was, I think, 20 something minutes long. So it will give you more value than this short recap. But if you are short on time, you could just listen to this one. It's up to you. You have the option. You live your life. You do whatever you want to do. But yes, strength training in hybrid training. So I'm not talking about how to progress strength training only. I'm talking about it in the context of a hybrid training program and a hybrid client, because that's what we do here. So short recap of the last episode. Well, before we get into that, I should say I have an awesome announcement coming out soon, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of this episode. So definitely stay tuned for that. And if you run out of time or whatever, you can skip to that and just listen to it. But yes, very cool announcement. I'm very excited. So stay tuned for that towards the end of the episode. But a short recap of the last episode: progressive overload is basically gradually increasing the training stimulus to elicit an adaptation, what adaptation we want, depending on, we want to get stronger, faster, all these different adaptations. In hybrid training, it becomes more complicated because that managing that training stimulus and adaptation spans multiple domains and even includes life stress. Progressive overload is about stressing your body more, but also recovering more. So it's about balancing progression and recovery. And in hybrid training, the recovery aspect becomes very crucial and difficult, or more difficult, I should say, more complex, because you have multiple training modalities that are all contributing to your training stress that you need to recover from, but you also have a certain minimum amount of each you need to do to progress. So it becomes a little more complex. So with that said, what does that specifically look like for the strength portion of hybrid training? That is this entire podcast. So how I progress strength in hybrid training with clients. Again, I mentioned progress is going to be limited by recovery, and it really is. Technically, if you were to measure your closeness to death or nearness to death or health directly before a session and after a session, technically you're going to be closer to death after a session than you were before it. Now, don't get concerned about saying you're going to die, but I'm just saying technically you're less healthy after a session than you were before. If you were to tell an alien all the things that happen during exercise, your blood pressure rises, your heart rate rises, your glucose utilization becomes higher, your energy stores go down, you create micro trauma to the tissues, they would tell you should not do that. That is horrible. Like, why are you doing that to your body? But that allows us to adapt and tell our bodies that they need to recover. Your body gets stronger and puts on muscle and even all the endurance stuff, but this podcast is specific to strength. Your body gets stronger and puts on muscle because it thinks it needs to in order to survive. It doesn't know that you're pushing a barbell or dumbbells in a safe gym or in a home gym. For all your body knows physiologically, it thinks you're pushing a log off of you or a rock off of you or whatever. It thinks that you need to do this to survive, and so it gets stronger and builds muscle because of that. We're literally hacking our bodies' systems to survive, basically, when we want to get stronger. Bodybuilders are literally making their bodies think they're dying unless they put on crazy amounts of muscle, and then they're providing exogenous or external hormones like testosterone and growth hormone and all these other things to give their bodies more capacity to build muscle. So it's kind of funny to think about, in a way, we are really literally hacking our bodies' need to stay in homeostasis and survive. So if you don't provide your body adequate stimulus, it's not going to adapt. Additionally, if you don't provide your body adequate recovery, you're not going to be able to make those adaptations, because the only time your body can make those adaptations is in recovery. Those adaptations, the rebuilding of tissues, the building of new tissues, new mitochondria, new capillaries, new muscle tissue, this all requires resources and energy. And if your body is in a state of thinking that it's potentially going to die or needs to do other things to survive, it's going to prioritize short-term survival over long-term adaptations, because if you die, then there's no reason to have long-term adaptations. So this is why overtraining and burnout and things like that can occur, because you're taking too you're using too many resources for immediate activity for all the extra training you're doing, and you're not giving your body time to relax, recover, and then make those adaptations for those long-term gains. So with hybrid training, it becomes a game of how can I run and lift and have enough in the tank to recover and adapt. Really, the game of any training, even if you're just a strength or endurance athlete, is how can I get the adaptations I want and have enough to in the tank to recover and adapt. But again, with hybrid training, there's an extra stressor on there, so it's more complicated. So one of the things I like to do, I've talked about this the last few episodes, is this concept of consolidation of stressors. I like to think of strength and endurance as their stressors on the body. So what are they doing from a nervous system perspective and from an energy system perspective? I'm not going to go in the weeds on those things. I do have a YouTube series on hybrid training where I talk about energy systems. It's rather powerful if you are new to this concept. But anyways, you can look at my YouTube channel in the description and find that under my playlist section. It's a hybrid training playlist. There's 4 to 6 videos and something like that. But anyways, you can break things into high intensity and low volume activities. So things like heavy back squats, sprints, these are things that are very high intensity, but you can't do a lot of volume because of how intense they are. And then you have lower intensity and higher volume things. So things like 500 walking lunges, right? That's a lot of volume, not a lot of intensity if you're doing body weight. It's not very heavy. Same thing with a long run. That's a lot of volume, but you cannot run for an hour or 90 minutes all out. That's going to be way too intense unless you're doing like a half marathon. And even then you're not running all out, right? You're pacing yourself so that you finish the race spent, but sprinting 100 yards, 50 yards, 50 meters, that's true all out, right? You can't do that for that long. And also I like to see or think about the skill component of an activity. So heavy strength training is more of a skill than a long run. And so when I'm programming, I like to put things that are higher skill first because they require more energy, they require more nervous system recruitment and more ability. So if you've already taxed yourself with something, then you're going to have less energy, less nervous system capacity to handle the higher skill movement. So I like to think of strength and endurance as those stressors because you can place them throughout the week similarly. So back squats and sprints are more similar than back squats and a long run. So we want to place things in the week that are going to let certain energy systems recover while others work. So I said this in the podcast where I talked about how I lay out a training week. I like to generally put higher intensity, higher skill things earlier in the week. And then as the week progresses, gradually shift to higher volume, lower intensity, lower skill demands, because it's going to help you recover from those higher intensity sessions and still work other energy systems and other parts of your nervous system and body. So yes, generally that's kind of how I lay out the week. That's not really this podcast, but some periodization examples, some ways that we can progress strength. I touched on this a little bit in the last episode, is we can increase the weight we use while maintaining our volume and endurance and even in the weight room. So I'm going to do a podcast next week on running, so I'm not going to get too in the weeds on that, but we can hold our endurance volume and even hold our strength volume while we increase weight. We could hold our strength steady during higher mileage run blocks. So I said this last episode, it's important to realize that if you're lifting, let's just say easy math, or it doesn't really matter what math we use, but let's just say you're benching 225 for 3 sets of 5 and you're running 10 miles per week. The next week, if you run 15 miles per week and you're still benching, well, let's do squats. Squats is it'll be a little bit more of a example. So say you're squatting 225 for 3x5, just for an ease of a number, and you're running 10 miles per week. The next week, you increase your speed work a little bit and you increase your long runs such that you're running 15 miles per week and doing a little bit of that extra running as higher intensity running on the track or on the road, whatever, speed work. And you still squat 225 for 3x5. Some people might think they haven't progressed their strength fitness, but they really have if it's a similar difficulty for you, because you're doing that strength work with less ability because you've run more, so you need to recover more from the running. So that's one thing I don't think people realize in hybrid training, but it's a really important metric of seeing where somebody's at, is how is their performance holding in the presence of more training stress in other areas. Another thing we can do is gradually progress the high intensity strength with lower volume while we build running. So keeping volume in the gym lower with higher strength components, heavier weights while we build running. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. We can be very creative. And I like to use RPE, relative perceived exertion. So I'll talk about that in the tools I use in a second, but it's very beneficial, especially for hybrid athletes for this reason. Into the tools that I use. So RPE, I'll just start off with that since I just mentioned it. Relative perceived exertion, it's generally a scale of 1 to 10. How heavy is this for you? I have an RPE guide that I can link in the description if you would like to see it, if you've never used RPE. But RPE, the way that I like to use it is, unless you have a powerlifting goal or a certain strength goal, I don't use a lot of percentages. I use a lot of relative perceived exertion because it allows you to auto-regulate your load based on how you're feeling. So if you don't have like a powerlifting goal, like on X date, I will lift Y weights, then it becomes a little less important what exact weights you're lifting and more important what stressor you're placing on your body. So if you feel real good one week, I want you to be able to go heavier and take advantage of how good you feel. If you feel really bad another week, I want you to pull back based on how bad you feel, such that your body is still stressed in the same way. So like an RPE 8 roughly means you have 2 reps left in the tank. So my goal for you might be to do 3 sets of 5 at an RPE 8, which means you're going to do 3 sets of 5 with a weight that you could do for 7 reps. So one week that might be heavier than another week. For a lot of people, there wouldn't be a lot of value in giving you a set weight and having you do it one week and it would be too easy, and another week it would be way too hard and you would fail. So RPE works really well for that. It's also used in running. We'll talk about that next week. But RPE is really useful for that. I also like to use a mix of RPE. So I will give people, like, for example, I have kind of a general progression plan I like to use that I adapt per client, but for a main lift perspective, I might do like an RPE 8. So work up to a single set of 5 at RPE 8 and then drop the weight by 20% and do 2 or 3 sets of 5. That allows us to do a little bit of percentage work, but regulate it based on how you're feeling that week. So RPE is very powerful. I have a whole guide on it. So if you want that, it'll be in the description. I like to use heart rate variability sometimes. I'm not going to go too in depth as to what heart rate variability is, but I say sometimes because it can be a good tool, but it can also be inaccurate. And it's not the most accurate metric unless you're in a lab measuring it, measuring it from your wrist or your finger or whatever. There's a lot of noise as you move around and things like that. So I look at it, but it's not gospel. I definitely look at sleep to see how recovered somebody is. If somebody's not getting a lot of sleep, then they may need lower volume, lower intensity certain days for certain sessions. I also look at soreness and delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS, to see. I actually did a podcast on DOMS. If you aren't familiar with what it is, you can go back and listen to that. It was a while ago. It's in the episodes. I don't remember the episode number. But if somebody's overly sore for a long period of time, that's a sign they might not be recovering well. I also look at performance trends over days and weeks. So not just a single day, but how has their performance been this whole week? How's their performance been the last 2-3 weeks relative to what it normally is and what we would expect it to be? If performance is declining, then I'm looking at that. That's kind of a red flag that, hey, maybe we're pushing too hard. Or if their performance is increasing, then looks good. Another one is the subjective markers. So I'm really big on the holistic coaching, the human coaching, the not just numbers side of coaching. And so I want to see, what is your mood like? How motivated do you feel relative to when we started training? How is your life stress? How is that potentially impacting our ability to progress strength? These are all important things. So for a client example, a recent example of what this looks like for a client, I have a client, he prefers to stay unnamed, so I won't mention his name. He kind of likes to keep his online presence a little bit less available, so always respecting that. When we started training, he was used to taking a deload every 4 to 5 weeks. A deload is where you progress training week to week, and then you take a down week to provide the ability to recover. They're really useful. He was used to taking a deload every 4 to 5 weeks, and when we got to that 4 to 5 week mark, he was kind of mentally ready to take a deload. He was kind of stressed, thinking he needed to take a deload, but all of his performance markers were up. So we didn't deload. I talked to him about it. We kind of talked through it. I asked him what he wanted to do, given what I shared. And he was like, I think this might just be a mental block. So like, let's push through it. We did push through it, and he felt good and actually set some awesome PRs the week and 1 and 2 weeks afterwards. He set some great PRs both weeks, like it was a big win for him mentally and physically to push through that deload. However, a deload was required eventually. He was very consistent with his training, and I knew there was going to be a deload required eventually. So eventually, as we kept pushing, we started to see a few things that caused us to decide to take a deload. First, we started to see decreased performance on high intensity, high nervous system requirement tasks. These are typically the things that go first. Things like change of direction. He plays paddle, so change of direction, he's feeling slower, feeling more sluggish, not playing as well when he would play paddle. These are the first things that really start to go when it comes to needing a deload or not being fully recovered, is these high nervous system things. Vertical jump is a good way to test somebody's recovery. If their vertical jump is normal or within a certain range, they're fine. If not, it's a sign that they're probably under recovered. We also started to see decreased motivation to train and decreased mood. So he was normally really excited about training, but he started to feel like training was kind of sluggish, kind of a have to, and not really enjoyable. And we also saw increased resting heart rate overnight. So I want to emphasize that this all happened while his numbers in the gym were still going up. So he was still performing well in the gym. And if all I did was look at him on a spreadsheet as a numbers and not as a human, not as a person, not as all these other things, I would have told him, let's keep going. We're fine. Clearly, though, he needed the deload. He wasn't feeling super great about training. His performance in paddle, which is something that is really important to him, he plays pretty competitively, was going down. This is an example where the training plan alone would tell us he doesn't need a deload because his performance is still going up. But all the other subjective measures he pointed to him needing the deload. And we did deload, and these things did resolve themselves, and performance is now going up again now that we're back into training after a deload. So I share that example for a real life example of what it looks like, but what it looks like when the numbers might not be the whole story. And this kind of comes in my approach to progressing strength in hybrid training. I mentioned this last episode, but most coaches just look at the sets, the reps, the weights, the paces, and running, but they aren't looking at the whole human, even though they might say they do. Some people say they do, but they don't actually, because it takes a lot of work and takes a lot of time to build that relationship and to work on those non-tangibles. It takes a lot of time. It's not easy. It's a lot of work. I love the work. I love working with clients, but a lot of coaches might even say they do, but they don't. They just say, oh yeah, I look at the whole human. And then they ask you like once every 2 weeks how you feel. And then they don't actually do anything with that information. That's why I do human first programming is what I talk about. I do watch the numbers in depth. I'm a nerd at heart. I have an Oura Ring. I have a Garmin at home. I have spreadsheets and Training Peaks data and all this awesome data. But I really, really also am passionate about assessing the client's mood, life stressors, mindset stressors, wins and progressions also mindset-wise, because that's a progression as well if you progress mentally. Hobbies like paddle or like other hobbies that they enjoy, and anything else that makes up you as a human. I'm really passionate about focusing on those things and seeing how they can give me a better picture of the numbers I'm seeing, or maybe show me things the numbers aren't showing me, as I just shared with that client that I almost said his name that will remain unnamed. Because the numbers did look good, but behind the scenes, there was a lot of signs showing that we needed to take a deload. I adjust training volume and intensity based on the overall readiness of you, and I assess it both quantitatively, so with the numbers, and qualitatively with the energy I'm feeling from you, with the stuff I'm getting from you in our check-ins and texts and your tone of voice and how you talk about training. Like I said, that kind of decreased mood was one of those big points for us with this client. It's important to show that just hybrid isn't about doing both, just doing both. I coach athletes to perform well in strength and endurance and whatever else they want to do as well, like these hobbies like playing paddle. And that requires nuance and responsiveness to you. Responsiveness to your check-ins, to your texts, to how your life progresses on top of training. You're not just a number on a spreadsheet. You're a human with emotions, fears, doubts, insecurities, motivations, relationships, a job. There's so many things that go into you, and your success with your hybrid goals is an extension of you. It's not separate. And so that's why I focus so much on building you, not just building your numbers on a spreadsheet. And this is why all these subjective things are so important when it comes to progressing strength in hybrid training. Now, if this episode hit home and you are like, hey, this sounds cool, I really want to get started with hybrid training, make sure you're on my email list. I'm going to be announcing something that I've been working a lot on in the background. I'm going to be announcing something big on September 8th, which is only 6 days away from the date this episode releases. And it's going out to my email list first, and mainly going out to my email list. So you definitely want to make sure you're there. You can unsubscribe at any time. So join, hear the announcement, see if it's for you. And if it's not, and you don't enjoy the regular emails, you can unsubscribe. It doesn't hurt my feelings. The link is in the description to join my email list. And again, you can unsubscribe at any time. Make sure you're on there. There's something big coming I'm very excited to announce, and I've been working really hard on it. So it's going to be a lot of value for a very, very, very affordable price, and you're not going to want to miss it. So make sure you're there. Next week's episode, like I said, is going to be the flip side to this one. So how do we progress running in hybrid training? So make sure you're subscribed so that you see that when it comes out. I'm excited to give you that episode and wrap up this whole progression in hybrid training from a general concept like last week to strength and then to running next week. So make sure you're there. Make sure you're subscribed. I'm excited to record that episode, and I will see you in the next episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast.